Okay, so good day everybody. Welcome to our second EC Bayes seminar for the year. Very excited to have Mary Llewellyn all the way from the University of Edinburgh talking virtually for us. Just before we get started, I want to acknowledge that the meeting that is physically taking place is happening on Turrbal and Yagara land. And these are places that have always been places of teaching and learning, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and just acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So today, as I said, we've got Mary Llewellyn, and she's going to talk on some exciting work on StateSpace models that I guess are sped up through discretization, which I'm really interested in hearing more about. So I'll just hand it over to you, Mary, to take over. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. So thank you so much for inviting me here today to be a part of your seminar series. Super excited. I'm going to talk on some work I recently published in preprint form on what I like to call an efficient method for state-space model fitting. And it's also 7 a.m. here, so I'm going to apologise in advance if there are some things that maybe don't make sense. It's nice to be up early anyway. So yeah, this was work undertaken as part of my PhD in statistics at Edinburgh, as Josh already said. And it's supervised by Professor Ruth King, Dr. Victor Elvira, and Dr. Gordon Ross. And in case you're interested in finding out a bit more about the work after this talk, we've got a preprint. The preprint is on the archive at this link, and it's called a point mass proposal method for Bayesian state-space model fitting. I'm not sure how you normally do questions with this type of thing. I'm sure Josh can interrupt if this isn't okay, but I'm happy to answer them as we go along. Or at the end. Okay, I'm going to assume that's fine.
Yeah, that sounds fine. Yep.
All right, yeah. So feel free to interrupt. I might not be able to see the chat, but I'm sure you can turn your microphone on or something to let me know. So yeah, as you may be able to tell by the title, the theme of this talk is on accelerating inference for state-space models by the use of hidden Markov models. And essentially the idea is that we're trying to discretize the continuous domain to do so. So I'll just go over what I'm going to talk about. So I'll firstly describe what we mean by a state-space model. Some of you probably know this, but just to mainly introduce notation. And then I'll talk about the kind of inferential problem we're trying to solve, so really set up the problem. And then I'll describe kind of the core ideas of the proposed method, and then how you actually might be able to implement the algorithm in practice, because some of you might be interested in actually doing that. And I'll sort of demonstrate the implementation and the practical things you have to consider through the lens of an actual implementation of the algorithm to give it a bit more context. And then finally, I'll make the case that the underlying kind of framework introduced here may lead to some exciting extensions and sort of avenues for future research as well. So that's the kind of outline of what I'll talk about. Okay, so first things first. Let's define sort of the class of model we consider. So we're considering discrete time state-space models. And for those of you who are sort of unfamiliar, the discrete time state-space models describes kind of discrete time series observations, so these Y's here, as sort of generated by an unobserved discrete time latent process. So the X is here. And that's the notation I'll use as well. So more precisely, the states kind of, I like to think of it, evolve of their own accord through time. And each observation is sort of emitted from an individual state. So here we're interested in modeling kind of an observed sequence of data via this unobserved latent process. It's kind of generative of these observations. So for generalities, keep things general, we're going to assume that we have continuously valued latent states, so latent states that take values in some continuous step. So sometimes this the StateSpace model will have a physical interpretation in which the continuously valued latent states may be directly of interest. And one of the examples of that, just to help with context, is perhaps where you have, say, a true but unobserved population growth rate about which we kind of observe noisy data. So the y's in this case, and then the underlying growth rate will be the x's. Sorry, my voice is a bit husky this time in the morning. Apologies. So, of course, we kind of endow this system with some probabilistic dynamics, and that describes the transitions between states. This isn't a deterministic process. So I'm going to describe these now. So mathematically, if we let this boldface theta be a vector of static parameters, i.e. the other parameters that kind of don't evolve with time, then the probabilistic dynamics of the state-space model are described by this initial state distribution. So that could quantify our sort of modeling belief about the initial state. And we also have a state transition distribution sort of describing how the latent process evolves through time. So this is sort of the state process. And then to describe how the data are emitted from those latent states, we have an observed state distribution sort of mapping the underlying states to the observations. Okay, so that's our sort of definition of a state-space model and an introduction to the kind of notation I use throughout the talk. I don't know if we had a question. I saw somebody pop up, but give it a second just in case. Okay, that's fine. So now kind of now we've got the kind of definition of a state-space model. I'm going to give a brief overview of the challenges associated with fitting them in the Bayesian context. So usually, not always, but usually we're sort of interested in inference on this posterior distribution. And I'm going to sort of assume that that's the case here. So this is the posterior distribution of the static parameters given the data. So something that's probably obvious to you about this, so apologies, is that this is kind of proportional to the prior on these static parameters multiplied by this likelihood here, this marginal likelihood. So it's marginal with respect to the fact that the states aren't included in that likelihood. So what I really want to focus on is this marginal likelihood term here, which is actually a source of a lot of issues when trying to fit the state-space model in this way. So here the marginal likelihood is given by the integral over the states of this joint distribution of the states and data given the parameters. So although we actually have the sort of component expressions for this joint distribution, so it's just the product of these system densities and this observation process density here, the integral of those component densities has no closed form apart from in very exceptional cases. So for general state-space models, it doesn't have a closed form. And what that essentially means is that we can't evaluate this marginal likelihood directly. And if we don't have a nice expression for this posterior, we can't actually use Metropolis-Hastings usually over the sort of parameter space. And that's the point I want to emphasize. So I'll go back to the sort of exceptional cases. So there are exceptional cases where this does have a nice closed form expression, and that's where the StateSpace model is linear and Gaussian. So it consists of linear and Gaussian distributions or densities, in which case you can get a nice estimate, you can get a nice marginal evaluation of the marginal likelihood using the Kalman filter. And the other case is when the state space is discrete and finite, in which case this integral reduces to a sum over the states. So there are approaches outside of these cases where you can use the marginal likelihood within a Metropolis-Hastings algorithm. And some of you are probably familiar with an algorithm that means that we can use that marginal likelihood, namely the particle marginal Metropolis-Hastings algorithm, where you can use Metropolis-Hastings by replacing you replace the marginal likelihood with an unbiased estimate from sequential Monte Carlo. But I'm not going to focus on that in particular. I'm mainly going to focus on a sort of different approach to the problem, which is to use data augmentation. So I like to think of this as sort of broadly deferring the kind of explicit initial integration step kind of till later in the algorithm. So we do that by obtaining kind of Monte Carlo samples jointly from this distribution of the static parameters and the states, which has a nice tractable expression. And you can do that using a sort of Metropolis-Hastings algorithm targeting this kind of the joint space induced by these. And then the kind of deferred integration step comes in the form of marginalizing over the states at the end of the algorithm, at the end, once we've obtained our MCMC samples, by just simply disregarding the samples for the state. It's worth saying that although I focused on inference on the parameters only, if we want inference on the parameters and states, then clearly we would just target this distribution to begin with, and it's a bit more intuitive. But I want to emphasize that you can kind of use it for both cases. So it's a sort of useful approach for the two cases. Okay, so I've kind of, does this actually solve anything? does this help us in any way? Well, practically, yes, because this joint distribution has a nice closed form expression. So it's the thing we had here, roughly. It's comprised of the thing we had here, a bit of extra stuff multiplied by the prior on the states. So it has a nice closed form expression, which means that we can target this joint density directly in the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm. So this isn't the only approach to actually perform those updates, but a popular approach when you have kind of potentially high dimensional target spaces is essentially to reduce the dimension of the updates by updating, partitioning the space as such, and updating components from their full conditional distributions. So this is the kind of specific updating strategy that we'll focus on here. So in iteration I of our Metropolis-Hastings algorithm, we'll first, although it doesn't matter which order necessarily, I don't think someone might correct me on that, but in iteration I, we'll update the states from their full conditional distribution, conditional on the current value of the static parameter at iteration I-1. And that will be targeting this full conditional distribution here. And then we'll update the static parameter kind of conditional on the value of the current value of the state, which is the state at iteration I now. So the sort of main advantage of breaking up the states and parameters in this way is because updating, kind of designing updates for theta in this way is quite straightforward typically. Not always, but it's generally more straightforward. But in this context, it's actually the main difficulty is designing updates for the states. So in the context of a Metropolis-Hastings algorithm, we probably can't use Gibbs sampling where in the general case. So we're going to require a proposal distribution for the states that somewhat captures this target density here. And that's the full conditional distribution of the states. So when I say full conditional distribution of the states kind of later on, this is what I'm referring to. So how can we update these states? Well, the most obvious approach is to just attempt to update all the states in one, so target this density exactly. So that's our challenge here. We're going to try and design a proposal distribution for these states, but it's actually pretty tricky to design an efficient proposal distribution for these states because this target distribution here is often kind of high dimensional. So it's as high dimensional as the number of states. There's a lot of states to consider, and often the number of states equals the number of observations. So if you have, for example, what I would call a relatively short set of time series data of length 100, you have 100 a density to design over 100 dimensional space. So designing a proposal distribution that's able to sort of capture that full conditional distribution that kind of sufficiently reflects it is often very difficult. A complex task. And if you try and use a kind of fairly basic proposal distribution, one that kind of takes into account this target distribution, then it'll typically be quite inefficient. So you have poor mixing or else a very long run time to kind of achieve sufficiently many high quality samples. One method some of you are probably very familiar with is designing proposal distributions via sequential Monte Carlo or conditional sequential Monte Carlo more specifically. Those sorts of approaches include the particle Gibbs algorithm, where you run your conditional SMC to propose moves for the entire state trajectory such that they're always accepted. I won't go into a lot of detail about the kind of detail of the algorithm here because I kind of want to focus on getting to our method, and it's a huge it's a huge thing, it's a very complex thing to try and explain. But that approach can be inefficient in situations where the kind of particle weights in the SMC recursions kind of start to degenerate. So I can have, although moves are accepted, you can have a kind of sticking behavior for some state-space models. So it's a good, it's a nice algorithm, it's a nice general solution, but it's not always the most efficient approach, and I'll show you that later. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, another option to design kind of proposal distributions, this full conditional distribution, is to sort of reduce the dimension of the required proposal distribution even further by updating the states in smaller blocks. So sort of illustrated what I mean by this here, what I mean by updating the states in blocks. So mainly we're trying to design proposal distributions for temporal blocks of states. So for example, we might design a proposal distribution targeting the full conditional distribution of the states at times 1, 2, and 3, conditional on the current value for the state at time 4. And then we'll update the states at 4, 5, 6, conditional on the states at times 3 and 7, and so on until all the states have been updated. So that's a fairly basic kind of blocking strategy where we've split the states into we've split consecutive states into blocks of 3 and updated each from their full conditional distribution. Okay, so in this case, we're kind of simplifying the design of the proposal distribution by kind of reducing the dimension of the target space, which means that we're often able to achieve a higher acceptance probability with a kind of coarse approximation to the target distribution. So we can get away with a kind of less accurate proposal distribution than before. It's worth saying that I will talk more about this later, but it's not kind of a magic fix. You'll end up inducing correlation between the samples at the block boundaries. So that is one way, because the kind of states at the end of the block are in some way dependent on the states on either side. So the kind of proposed moves can only, accepted moves can only be so far from those kind of anchor values. But in general, we can kind of say that you can use a coarser approximation if you just kind of reduce the dimension of the target space by using block updates a little bit. So you can just do that a little bit and it kind of improves things. So a sensible approach might be, I mean, you could try and use your sort of standard symmetric proposal distributions where you have kind of random walk. You could probably use that, but you'd perhaps use quite low block updates. But to try and kind of maximize the size of the blocks that we're using to improve mixing and ultimately efficiency, it's quite natural to kind of consider the tractable cases and see how they can be used to capture some of the dynamics of the underlying system, in this case, to design a nice proposal distribution. So one approach to this, we had the 2 tractable cases before. So we had the linear Gaussian case of the StateSpace, the case where the StateSpace model is linear and Gaussian, in which case we have nice tractability properties, and the discrete case. So a sensible approach, therefore, is to try and capture, or generally sensible approach is to try and capture some of the kind of underlying dynamics using linear and Gaussian approximations. So I've given examples of sort of potential proposal distributions we could use here. Played about with some of these, probably some of you have too. They can be quite useful and quite efficient. But in general, for general state-space models, using proposal distributions that rely on these linear or Gaussian assumptions can be a bit problematic because often you have state-space models that aren't well approximated by the linear Gaussian system. So therefore, for the general case, it seems quite natural that we should also consider the uses of the kind of discrete approximation. So the alternative approach is to, well, I'll describe what it is to do, but the one that we're going to focus on is how we can use discrete approximations to formulate proposal distributions for these block updates of the states. I mean, I'm going to argue that they're less parametric with respect to the assumptions they make about the kind of underlying dynamics of the state-space model, so less parametric than using linear and Gaussian approximations. So they could, that kind of motivates them as a potentially powerful tool, where you have more complex dynamics, or where you just want, you're not really sure which method to use, but you know that eventually this method will be quite efficient, if that makes sense. So as far as we know, using kind of discrete approximations to capture the state-space model dynamics hasn't yet been used to kind of formulate proposal distributions for updating the latent states. And there are some potentially obvious reasons about validity, but the idea and the basis of our talk is to kind of formulate a way in which we can use them in a valid way and achieve a kind of efficient performance. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the work, for the rest of the talk. Work on the brain. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense so far. I'm going to maybe pause for a second just in case anyone has any questions. No? Okay. Right. Oh. Right. I'm sort of using multiple devices to do this. My laptop is playing up with my microphone. Thanks, Kerry. Okay, so as you may have anticipated, the overall idea behind this work is to use the discrete and tractable approximations to the state-space model as a Metropolis-Hastings proposal distribution. And we're going to do this in two steps. So the entire methodology will be described by this two-stage process. So first comes the discretization step. So we impose a grid on the state space, which induces a hidden Markov model approximation to the state-space model. And then we use this approximate hidden Markov model to propose a sequence of grid cells. And it'll be clear what I mean by grid cells. And remember, in this case, we can propose a sequence of grid cells from a discrete distribution because we're in the nice kind of realm of tractability. So that's quite nice. Nice place to be. And secondly, we kind of address a point that is probably concerning some people. So clearly, if we only propose values in a discrete space, we're not going to have a Metropolis-Hastings algorithm that converges to the target distribution, right? So we kind of ensure matching between the proposal and target spaces by proposing continuous values from within the space of the already proposed grid cells. It's kind of taking it back to the kind of continuous domain after that. Okay, so this is the two-stage process versus discretization, and then we're reversing the discretization. Might seem a bit counterintuitive, but hopefully it will make sense when I get into the proposed framework. So step one is to kind of introduce this discretization, and this is a very pathological example of what you might do. But in this case, we're introducing a deterministic discretization by partitioning the state space at each time point into intervals. So we'll start with, so this is the state space at time one, and we'll partition the space by forming boundaries. Note that this kind of interval could be infinite. So once we've done that for time one, then move through and introduce a scheme for defining the intervals at time two. And we're going to do that all the way up until time capital T, the length of our data, the state process. And once we've done this for all time points, we've essentially imposed a grid. So although it's kind of a bit abstract because it's a grid across the time domain and the state spaces, this visually looks like a grid, right? So this, when I refer to grid, this is what I mean. So this is time, space, and we're gridding this. And once we've sort of got that grid, we might observe that the StateSpace model has been reduced to a hidden Markov model in these grid cell indices. So to see this, consider the kind of grid cells that we have here. So here there are capital N grid cells at each time point. So the state space of the HMM is the indices of each of those grid cells, 1 to N, 1 to capital N. So if we think about the dynamics between, sorry, I'm just going to go back to this, it's confusing you. So if we think about the sort of dynamics of the transitions between the grid cell indices kind of dictated by the StateSpace models, then what drops out is the dynamics of an HMM. So the probability of going from this index at time 1 to this index at time 2 will be given by a transition matrix in terms of the StateSpace model densities. So mathematically, to explain that a bit more robustly, to explain the whole system robustly, we can write the process by which the states evolve in the discrete domain and the way in which the observed data originates from those states using the StateSpace model densities. So this is the probability that the state belongs to the nth little m grid cell at time 1. And that's, of course, so let's take this initial state distribution as an example. That's, of course, the integral over that interval at time 1 of the state space of the initial state distribution of this, of the initial state density that we've got from our StateSpace model. So we have that these mass functions, well, these mass functions, this isn't a mass function, but they're integrals of the densities, of the StateSpace model densities across the grid cells. And it's often not easy to evaluate those integrals. So you can in some cases, but it's not always easy. So to kind of add to the generality of the method, we're going to approximate these integrals, which is often gives me a slight heart palpitation. The whole aim of this work is to do that, right? But in this case, we've got fairly low dimensional component parts. So we're going to use really simple deterministic integration methods to approximate these values here. These mass functions here. So by simple, I literally mean as simple and deterministic as you can imagine. So things like midpoint integration, basically just approximating the density by a quadrilateral of some form. And that's basically the rule for higher order scalings as well. So very, very simple. We take the midpoint of the cell and then, so now that we have the sort of, we've approximated each of these, what we have is a kind of explicit form of the HMM approximation to the system. And we can use this HMM, the nice tractability of this HMM and all the nice properties that come out of it, to sample from an approximation to this conditional distribution. One way you can do this at a reduced computational cost, a fairly low computational cost, and that's opposed to having to calculate all the probabilities of all possible combinations of state values that the states can take at all time points. That would obviously be quite expensive computationally, but you can use from Rubina's work, if you're familiar with it, the forward filtering backward sampling algorithm for hidden Markov models. So the framework is sort of already there for a nice way to reduce the computational complexity of this algorithm. So we've introduced this HMM approximation to the StateSpace model, and we've applied forward filtering backward sampling. And in doing so, what we obtain is a kind of sample trajectory, so proposed trajectory of grid cells. So we're not proposing point values at this point, we're proposing entire grid cells, right? But they're indexed, so we're proposing grid cell indices. So going back to the grid we imposed before, and I promise you this is the same grid, it's a bit higgledy-piggledy, but kind of going back to what we had before, we might sample, say, this grid cell at time 1. This is what our forward filtering backward sampling algorithm has told us. We've sampled this grid cell at time 2, and we're doing this all the way until time capital T, in which case we've sampled this value here. And since we've kind of tried to approximately capture some of the dynamics, or well, the kind of true conditional density, so we've formulated some sort of approximation to this, we're able to sort of approximately locate high posterior density regions or high conditional density regions of the space. So this is sort of directing our Metropolis-Hastings algorithm to kind of, I guess, relevant areas of the space. And deterministically, that's a kind of important thing to note as well. We've done that deterministically. Okay, so as yet, we're not quite there. So we've obtained a sample from the discrete representation of the posterior of the conditional density. I keep saying posterior, sorry. So clearly using the fact that we have a sample from this discrete representation means that we don't have a valid Metropolis-Hastings distribution, a proposal distribution. So to solve this problem, we're now going to propose continuous values from within each of the sampled grid cells. So basically what we do is we propose point values from a distribution with domain that matches the grid cells we've sampled. I'll get into a bit more what kind of suitable choices are. But for now, we can sort of say, as far as the fact that we've added this step to ensure matching between the proposal and the target spaces. And I've put here, I've put here that it's relatively easy to show that the arising proposal distribution results in a kind of procedure ergodic with respect to the target distribution. We give more details of this in the paper in case you're interested. But if you see the kind of exact form of the density written down, it reduces to something very simple. There's no kind of tricks that I've seen in particle MCMC algorithms where you get, you know, nice cancellations. It literally is the fact that choosing the grid cells and the location of the states are not independent processes. So it is a very simple cancellation that actually results in it being ergodic. Okay, I'm going to go back just quickly, just because I don't think I really mentioned this, how what I mean exactly by proposing continuous values from within sampled grid cells. I'm just going to go back to this slide to elaborate. So if we've selected, for example, this grid cell at time 1, if it's infinite, then I might propose values from some distribution that has a lower bound, the boundary of the grid cell, and then an infinite upper bound. And I'll propose continuous values using that distribution. So that's what I mean by kind of proposing from a restricted domain, or proposing from within the grid cells. Okay, hopefully that's clear. I'm just going to check if we've got any questions. I don't think so. Okay, I'll try and speed it up a bit because I know it's quite late over there. It's very early here, but okay. So far I've sort of explained the two-stage methodology of the algorithm. So first, reduce the StateSpace model to a discrete hidden Markov model, and then sample sequences of grid cells to sort of direct a sampler into high posterior regions. And then the second stage was to map back to the continuous space using a sort of domain restricted continuous proposal distribution, proposing from within those grid cells. So hopefully that's all clear. Be happy to elaborate on any of that. But I'll now explain and sort of tie up some loose ends with respect to implementation, so how you would actually implement this algorithm. So along the way, I've kind of subtly introduced a few decisions that you have to make, primarily regarding these points here. So I'll give some details of each of these in turn, and discuss the kind of trade-offs involved with making each decision. Okay, so the first point is regarding the choice you have to make about defining the grid cell boundaries. So in practice, how would we set the partitions in the state space to form the grid cells? I mean, the most maybe obvious way to do it is to use kind of equally spaced grid cells at each time point. So that's where the boundaries are equidistant, maybe apart from in the infinite grid cell, any infinite grid cells. So if we use this approach, if we use equally spaced grid cells, this is nice and it's computationally cheap because you only need to calculate one hidden Markov model transition matrix per iteration of your Metropolis-Hastings algorithm. But you might need a lot of grid cells to be able to capture the kind of high posterior density regions sufficiently, and you might be wasting computational time in kind of areas with a lower, that need a kind of lower approximation error, right? So that's probably okay for certain forms of state space models, but you can make a kind of tweak to this. You can make several tweaks to it, but the tweak that we're going to consider is by defining the grid cell boundaries using the quantiles of some distribution, or some distribution centered on the kind of current state of the chain from the previous iteration. So you might use, for example, to partition the space at time 1, we might use a Gaussian distribution centered around the state at time 1 from the previous iteration, with some tunable variance, but we're going to take the quantiles of that distribution to define the boundaries. And this means it sort of looks a bit more like a random walk algorithm in this case, because we're using the previous value, or else a kind of adaptive scheme. The justification is it's more like a random walk algorithm, but later on, all the calculations are semi-independent of the previous state. So actually, although it kind of looks like a random walk algorithm, you're not kind of inheriting all the benefits and criticisms of it. But you're still able to kind of focus the grid cells in regions of hopefully high posterior density by the same logic as random walk algorithms. Hopefully that sort of makes sense. So secondly, well, actually, so if we introduce a quantile grid like that, we have to calculate the transition matrices. We have to calculate more transition matrices per iteration. That is if we center on each of the current states at each time point, and we've got a lot of transition matrices to calculate. So that increases the computational cost of the algorithm. So although the quantile grid might give us better mixing properties, a higher acceptance probability, all that nice kind of stuff, we might end up with that costing a lot. So there's definitely a trade-off to be had between the computational cost of introducing a more complex method for defining the boundaries and the kind of resultant benefits to mixing. Okay, the second point, the number of grid cells, it comes with a similar trade-off that's perhaps more easy to explain. So using more grid cells simply, well, most of the time we'll give a better approximation. I don't want to say always, but most of the time we'll give kind of lower approximation error with respect to the posterior or the conditional distribution, the conditional density. And most probably that will give better mixing in the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm in the samples that we've got. But that comes at an extra computational cost. So it might actually be more efficient to use fewer grid cells. And that's a kind of key theme that we'll touch on, well, I'll touch on quickly in a second. Okay, the third thing you might want to consider is that you have to define a method for deterministically integrating the state-space model densities in each grid cell. So that's the step where we're actually trying to get an expression for hidden Markov model, the system of the hidden Markov model. So in our paper, we focused on just using very simple midpoint integration, as I said before. But we did try kind of higher order integration methods. So by higher order, I literally mean using the trapezium rule, which should give lower approximation error, right? But introducing that step was very costly and not really worth the mixing benefits. It's not impossible that an even better approximation, an even better deterministic integration method would give better performance and be worth the cost. But what we just focused on was using midpoint integration for now. Okay, so there are all sorts of things that relate to how the hidden Markov model is approximated. Now, defining the kind of within cell proposal distributions in step 2, in theory, I did sort of touch on this already, but in theory, you could use a nice continuous proposal distribution that sort of captures the conditional density in the region of the grid cells. But it's probably not going to be very easy to design, right? Because that's the whole reason we're doing this. So we simply use uniform distributions if we have finite grid cells, or for example, a truncated Gaussian distribution to sample values in infinite grid cells that are bounded above or below. And you can also use kind of one other thing we did is use a shifted Poisson distribution. So yeah, the last point is related to step 1 and 2, but it's not explicitly either of them. You have to make a decision about how many states to update in a block. And as someone familiar with block updating strategies within the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm, or Gibbs sampler is quite common. Updating a small number of states in each block leads to poor mixing, because we're essentially inducing, or we're not accounting for the correlation at the block boundaries. So there's only so far that the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm is likely to move, and it's sort of anchored to the point where the states on either side. But on the other hand, if we update too many states in each block, our acceptance probabilities are going to be really low, unless you use a really good hidden Markov model approximation. So we would generally advise some sort of pilot tuning to determine an appropriate number of blocks to update, an appropriate number of states to update in each block. But when done correctly, using block updates can add a lot to the efficiency of the algorithm. So it's worth considering how you might be able to do that efficiently for your problem. In both of our examples in the paper, we were using blocks of size 3 or 4. So we're updating 3 or 4 states at once, and we were also overlapping the states in each block to kind of minimize that correlation effect at the boundaries, which is a valid approach. So with all of that in mind, sorry if I'm running a bit late. Am I okay for time?
I think my microphone's working. Yep. Yeah, we're probably another 5-ish minutes. And
okay,
we'll do
yeah,
some
so the
questions.
last thing's just
a
little
great.
case study. Okay.
Cool.
Oh. I'm brilliant at just talking and talking. Quite bad, sorry. So I'm not going to go through the mathematical details of this. I probably wouldn't even if I had time, because it's not necessarily the thing that I'm interested in. But basically the idea is this case study is applying the proposed algorithm to infer the latent states and static parameters of Nicholson's model for near chaotic population growth. If you're interested, the mathematical details are here. I've substituted in the static parameter values at which the data was simulated, but you can also see this in the paper. So yeah. So we want to infer the latent states and also the static parameters. The main thing I want to focus on here is that the dynamics of the latent states, the unobserved states here are the sequence of R's, exhibit a sort of near chaotic, jumpy dynamics. So designing a proposal distribution that captures that can be very difficult, and is traditionally been quite a challenging task. With that in mind, we applied the PJS algorithm, the Parkwood-Gibbs ancestor sampling algorithm, and it simply didn't converge. So using 1,000 particles and 10,000 iterations with, which took about 20 hours of, I mean, it was fairly primitive computational power, but it was the same for all of the approaches we tried, so it took about 20 hours. If you're a practitioner, you might not want to use a supercomputer to do it, so it might be an accurate reflection of the actual time taken for some people. That's my logic anyway. So yeah, the PJS algorithm is not convergent in this example, but well, that's a plot of the data, but I won't focus on that. So in this case, we can use the proposed algorithm with grid cells centered on the current state, so with these quantile grids with centering, and we can use that to define the grid cell boundaries and achieve pretty good performance. I think the main logic is that because we have this jumpy state process, centering on the current state is quite a powerful tool to help us locate the current state and maybe the next one as well. So here we used 25 to 50 grid cells. You can see the range of the data is quite large here. So you need a few more grid cells than with other examples. And yeah, you can achieve pretty good, what I would call pretty good mixing convergence, at least within about 2 to 7 hours, depending on the number of grid cells. And that's 2 to 7 hours with the same, running on the same computational power as PJS, just to be clear. And yeah, I think the most notable thing here, just to say it quickly, I know I've got like 30 seconds left, whatever. The most notable thing here is to bear in mind that introducing the deterministic aspects of the grid using this centered approach has actually been extremely powerful at dealing with a kind of near chaotic behavior. So that's the kind of takeaway point I guess I want to make. And yeah, I won't run through all this because I've got a summary slide and a further research slide. I won't go through the summary, I think, just because I've been talking for quite a long time now, and hopefully I've made it clear what the method is. A sort of general method for fitting general state-space models, but the most exciting directions for future research rely on extending the kind of underlying framework to account for different things, and also using different definitions for the tuning parameters. One thing might be kind of automated tuning, one thing might be combining the deterministic aspects of this algorithm with Particle MCMC methods. And one thing might also be to, for example, define the grid cell boundaries using an accurate method or an efficient method that isn't computationally expensive or isn't too computationally expensive. So they're kind of future research points. I will stop now because I'm getting sick of the sound of my own voice. But if you want to discuss any of this, I'm very happy to talk about it. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was a really fantastic talk, really well motivated. I found it really clear to understand why you were taking this approach. And I was really glad that you talked about all the little particular choices and trade-offs for those choices that you had to make once you had established what the kind of overall method was going to be. I have maybe a clarification / technical question, but before I ask that, I'll just ask anyone else in the room or online if they want to ask a question first. Matt, you want to come up and you can see another face if you'd like to, not just mine.
Great.
Hey, thanks for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I was just wondering, you use the idea of, obviously we often do a Gaussian approximation because you get exactness, and then going the discrete setting because you get the same sort of idea. Just sounded really interesting. And have you considered applications to other areas, like latent Gaussian model type models, but instead using a discrete sort of approach? Or yeah, anyway, thanks again for it was really good.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for your comments. So the other example in the paper was where the latent process originates from a Gaussian mixture. So states evolve as per a Gaussian mixture. Aside from that, we tested it on quite a few applications, but we haven't focused. We tried to focus on like several different ones, but I'm not sure that we focused it on exactly the example that you were saying.
Yeah, that answers
Do.
that's questions. Yeah. Anyone else before I jump in? So I was wondering, to do with, I guess, around your comments on it being kind of like a random walk, but not maybe what you're trying to say, it didn't have as much dependency as a standard random walk. Was that to do with the choosing of the grids in a kind of an adaptive way? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, if you could just clarify that for me, just so I make sure that I understood correctly.
Yeah, no worries. So the random walk part was to do with choosing the grid cell boundaries. So if we center the grid cells at each time point on the current state from the previous iteration, then that kind of looks like a random walk algorithm, right? Because we're kind of using some sort of centering. So the intuition behind using that is kind of motivated in random walk algorithms. But because ultimately you calculate, you approximate the hidden Markov model sort of more with respect to the static parameters or the approximation methods, its dependence is weaker on the current state than if we were using like a traditional random walk algorithm where we were only centering on the current state and there were no kind of other steps to kind of temper the dependence on the current state, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And is that where you had to be careful about proving ergodicity as well? Is that because of that adaptivity?
Yeah. So,
okay. All right. Yeah.
So yeah, if you use the most recent state, right? If you use the current state to center the grid, then it's fine. Essentially, it's ergodic. But if you try and do things like only defining the boundaries every, say, 20 iterations, so using something that adapts less frequently to the current state to kind of reduce the cost, then you get into this kind of dangerous territory where it might not be ergodic anymore. And that's kind of rooted in the adaptive methodologies. So one thing you can do in that case is to introduce some diminishing adaptation condition where you stop adapting the grid after a certain number of iterations, or you kind of have an adaptation level that tends to 0, right? But does that answer?
Yeah, no, that was it. And my only other question I had was you mentioned about higher dimensions in the latent state in your final slide, but what is how many dimensions have you gone to so far?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we haven't gone to many dimensions. So this was a kind of interesting thing to investigate, scalability. However, my feeling, and the sort of reason for me saying this is that because you get quite good performance, good efficiency with relatively few grid cells, the scalability properties are much better than other methods where you need, for example, to not name any specific methods, but a few hundred particles to do the same thing, right? Sorry. But yeah, my feeling is that it might scale a bit better, but I guess until we do it, we don't know, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's always application specific at some point.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I don't think there's any more questions. I just want to say thanks again, Mary, for presenting for this seminar series and getting up early to talk to us at 7 your time. We did not mind the husky voice at all. That was fine. And hopefully we will be seeing you in person at various conferences. If you go to ISBA, there'll be people that are in this room that will be there. And yeah, I'm sure they'll introduce themselves at the next conference they see you at. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.